Welcome to the Chronicles of Master Yao. I am Master Yao. I want to first of all thank you for following me and doing me the honor of listening to this story that I'm telling about my life. I think this is episode number 10, I believe. And let me start by saying that a lot of the material that we talk about is in this book, Awakening the Master Masculine. If you feel that I haven't fully explained something on one of these videos, oftentimes you can find a more detailed explanation in that book or one of the other books that I've published. So in the last episodes, building up to this one, the first 9 episodes, we've been kind of giving you the lay of the land. We've been kind of trying to deal with subjects that are pretty straightforward and simple, giving you the background, the story from my life from the college years up to about the age of 31. And we're going to kind of skip ahead a little bit and talk about now in the next few episodes more intimate aspects of my life and the people around me, and in this episode especially the females. And so, you know, as in the other episodes, the approach I'm taking here is talking about my personal experience as well as what the general experience of men and women around me had in the later part of my life. And we're going to now go a little bit deeper into the subject matter than we did in the first 9 episodes. And some of the material is going to get a little bit esoteric, I guess, or whatever you want to call it. But we feel that now that you've kind of gotten a feel for some of the concepts that we've explained before, we can present this to you now, and you'll be able to appreciate it as I do, and some of my friends did. Again, some of the subject matter is pretty difficult to entertain. And I want to repeat again that we're not, all of this, you know, we don't call anyone's names. We're not talking about any specific person. We always try to draw conclusions on the general population from what happened to this set of men that I associated with. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about the shaping and organizing factors, the conditions that have caused black women to be the way that they are. So, you know, from the time that I was a teen till the present day, I observed different things shaping the being of the modern black woman. And it's going to surprise some people, I guess, because a lot of people know me from this period in my life, that period in my life, that period in my life, but they don't see the whole big picture. And really, the title of this episode should be The Epigenetics of the Modern Black Woman. So, what are we talking about? When, you know, if I try to define the black woman today as I see her and as some of my friends see her, that composite, you know, it's a generalization, yes. But we cannot define her based on what we see today. That is an inaccurate conclusion that's going to be drawn. Going to lead you astray. Don't do it. To understand the black woman today, you've got to go back 5, 6 generations and see the progression. And that's the trick to it. That's why so many people are going to miss it and have missed it. What is epigenetics? Well, we can say that the black woman today is in the midst of a long-term, gradual process of change. And this is a change in her sexual orientation. Nothing short of that. It's at a very deep level. You know, we're talking about a change that has been taking place 4 or 5 generations or longer. The black woman today is not who she was in the 1900s, the way that she was before I was born. She's not the woman like my grandmother. She is diminished. When we talk about this change that occurs over generations, we're talking about the science of epigenetics. So we're not saying that the DNA itself has changed. No. Humans, black women, and all other humans have the same DNA that they had 1,000 years ago. What has changed is the coding sequences, the markers along the histine spools of the DNA, the things that determine if a gene or a gene set is active or inactive. We call these the methyl groups, or whatever you want to call them, and other factors there. And I mean, no one really understands it completely. I certainly don't. But it's very, very real. And science itself is beginning to acknowledge it and beginning to map it out. So there are two things here that has caused this progression that brings the black woman to what she is today. Number one, it's a form of self-neutering that the black woman has subjected herself to over these generations. That's a harsh word, I know. And it's a form of sexual suppression. It's mainly caused, remember, over generations by religious dogma. It's reinforced by strict parents. And it's further embedded by trauma, stressful living conditions, and fear of becoming pregnant. So I don't think anybody can argue that the environment that black people have lived in for the last 150 years has been very stressful, very toxic. The second thing that has caused this transformation, this conversion of the black woman to what she is today over these generations, is a long-term practice of practicing what we call counterfeit spiritual systems or counterfeit religions. A lot of people don't understand the damage that these things do. Now, in the episode number 9, we talked about the 3 Judeo-Christian religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and how they were redone to accommodate governments, and that it put them into a situation where they're not natural anymore. And that's pretty much what we're talking about. We're saying that because she's been practicing these things, they impact on her energetic body, her auric field, her spirit, if you will, and they have corroded it. And this thing has been happening over a long period of time, so that it's had a negative impact on her genome manifestation. So what we're saying is that this damage from these two factors builds up over time. And it progresses in a particular way. Here's how it progresses. Number one, it first progresses as a damage or an influence to her energetic body, her spirit. Secondly, it manifests as a damage or a change from its normal state of her psychology to a more abnormal state. In other words, we're saying it's made her psychology abnormal. Number 3, it can and has changed her physical body, her cells, her organs, her bone structure. And what we mean mainly is that you first see this change show up as a change in her hormonal system, her endocrine system. We'll get more into each of these things a little bit later. So the basic statement that we're going to say throughout this episode is that 50% or more of black women are incapable of navigating a relationship with a man. She's born that way. And it's a potential when she's born that's got to be developed one way or the other. But still, this is not something that's occurring completely in current society. It's something that's born into her. It's epigenetic. We're not talking about black men today. We're not talking about society. We're not talking about racism today. We're just talking about the black woman as she is. We're not blaming her. We're not blaming her. We're just talking about an observation that can be codified. We're saying that 50% of black women today cannot function or navigate a relationship with a man. And this is a fact borne out by divorce statistics, relationship time, and experience. Time and time again, the evidence is irrefutable. She's not able to do it. It's not that she has the choice. She cannot. She cannot. It doesn't have anything to do with the man. In episode 8 and 9, we spoke of the 4 races, and we talked about, their elemental affinities. The Asian race having an elemental affinity, the African race having a water elemental affinity. And so we basically said African Americans, for the most part, with some minor exceptions, have an affinity to the water elemental culture. This is something that's inside of her, that's in her genes. And we talked about the 2 driving pivotal forces in elemental culture are religion and sex. Those are the pivotal things. And so for many generations, the black woman has been sexually suppressed. Primarily because her primary chosen religion is not compatible to her. And that religion is anti-sexual. And it's set up an environment that's antagonistic to sexual expression. And as she's developed in a stressful culture over these years, she has passed on anti-sex programming to each generation, which has been building up cumulatively for 4 or 5 generations, depending on the woman. We're also saying that she's been practicing this corrosive religious practice. Mainly we're talking about Christianity here. And that because she's been constantly exposed to this generation after generation, it's corroded her spirit. And this has had a negative impact to her genetic makeup, to her gene pool, which affects so many things. And we're saying that this thing is compounded. It's something that's been happening generation after generation after generation. And so she has been passing on a corrosive type of gene message to each succeeding generation in the maternal bloodline. We're saying that women who are, their family bloodlines have mixed appreciably with white blood stocks or Asian blood stocks, which are a different elemental, that they are more susceptible to this damage because the European gene is not very dominant and has other reasons for it. It's a fire culture type thing. We're saying that African women or African American women who are highly melanated, very dark skinned, and who have experienced less mixing with other races is less susceptible to this damage. The African gene is very strong. And that's a very important consideration here. You're going to find that the darker the woman and the more pure her African blood, the less damaged she is by epigenetic layering. So a lot of people, when I mention this in different talks and whatever and things, a lot of people question my findings. But there is an abundance of empirical evidence in society to support what I'm saying. Let's give you 2 examples. I want you to think about this because there's plenty of examples if you know what you're looking at. But we often explain these things off to other things because people aren't really looking at things over a long period of time. They're looking at what they see today, and you're often, led astray by that. So in the 1980s, large numbers of black women embraced feminism. So you say, yeah, so what? Well, in the decades prior to that, black women almost unanimously rejected any feminist ideology. What was going on when they first came out of slavery? Black women embraced a matriarchal community standard. That's how they saw themselves as being a participant in the community, and that's how they saw themselves in relationship to men. And the matriarchal lifestyle is directly opposed to a feminist. It's the polar opposite of feminism. So for so many generations, and going back into Africa, you've got females embracing a matriarchal type of a community layout. And all of a sudden, in the space of 20 years, they flip-flopped, and so many of them embraced feminism. And my finding is that they didn't do it based on any kind of a political thing. There was no catalyst causing them to do this. And this had been introduced prior to that, and they had rejected it. They accepted it because of a mental illness. It was mental illness. It's because of abnormal psychology that was already there, which set the stage for them embracing this doctrine. It's epigenetics. Let's give you another example. For more than a century, in the 1800s, 1900s, we found a very strange thing. White women were susceptible to breast and cervical cancer and other cancers. Black women were resistant to it. It was very rare for black women to develop these types of cancers. All of a sudden in the 1970s, the rate of cervical and breast cancer in black women started to register and started to creep up. And then it shot up abnormally fast. And people couldn't explain it. They still can't. Why? Why did black women all of a sudden start developing breast cervical cancers and also non-cancerous fibroids at such a rapid pace? It's because of epigenetics, because of the hormone imbalances and other things that was going on. And, I haven't done any clinical trials or any university-based research to substantiate this, but I think there is enough empirical data to show that this shouldn't have happened. People want to explain it by pollution and diet and things like that, which contribute. But if that were the case, this should have been happening back in the 1800s. Why did it start happening when it did? Almost at the same time that women started embracing feminism. It's not that the two things are connected, it's that the epigenetics were there. They had reached that point where the change started to be impacted into the physical body, into the cell structure. So let's go back to our central point. 50% of single black women are incapable of navigating a male-female relationship to a successful conclusion. And so we have to ask why. We have to ask why. And there's really no reasonable explanation for it, empirical or otherwise. So some people say, well, it's economics, poverty. No, black women and black men were poorer economically in the 1800s and did much better. There was almost no divorce. You can say education. She's better educated now than she ever was. It's made things worse. It hasn't helped. Lack of men, the census doesn't bear that out. Gay men, even with gay men, and let's take the bisexual men, still, it leaves millions of single men available. So that argument is shot down. It's not the men, their availability or otherwise, as we spoke about in episode number 5. So, black women have produced a whole set of folklore about why they're in the situation, relationship-wise, that they're in. But none of it's backed up by any type of science that makes any sense, or any type of logic, any type of reason. It just seemed to have descended out of nowhere. And about 50 years ago, it just seems like all of a sudden black women lost their innate ability to deal with relationships. Well, you could blame it on men, but that really doesn't make sense. There's no environmental factor current at the time that the change occurred that would succinctly explain it. And my theory is that it's epigenetic in origin, that they were born that way. And then when things in the society or the environment triggered the predisposition, then it occurred. We can say that, we can see evidence of this anti-male, anti-relationship predisposition in girls, black girls, as early as the age of 9 when you test them. 9. There shouldn't be any predisposition toward relationship success in a 9-year-old girl, no matter how much she's exposed to the internet. Some people want to say, okay, it's molestation and incest and things like that, but it occurs before women reach puberty. And we find the same phenomena in women who never experienced molestation as we do in women who do. So molestation is not the answer. The conclusion is that it has very little to do with men in its foundation, and it has to do with epigenetics. I conclude that black women today are born with a predisposition to fail in relationships, which they did not have 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And I conclude that when women are successful, it's because the black woman has overcome this predisposition, where she's risen above it, she's fought against it, and she's been able to achieve relationship success in spite of it, which is a credit to black women. Once we accept this conclusion, based on biological and energetic science, then it sort of clears, and we can see the state of the black woman much better. In fact, then we can list what's happening in this age, in this time, currently. We can look at the factors shaping her dysfunction or lack of dysfunction, and we can come up with a very concise, a very clear formula, recipe, or blueprint, if you will, for when women are going to be viable in relationships and when they're not. And we're going to find that this set of factors is extremely accurate. In other words, we're saying that female relationship and female sexual behavior and reaction is completely predictable. So you have to start with the epigenetic baseline that I spoke about, which is difficult to quantify, but we can see some of the things, and in a future episode we're going to get deeper into what that baseline looks like. But if we start with that epigenetic baseline, then we have 14 shaping factors that determine whether that gene disposition is going to express itself or not. So we're saying she's born with this predisposition. Then basically what happens in the environment and what happens socially is going to determine if it's expressed or not, or if she's going to defeat it and become a successful, viable woman anyway, in spite of it. So number one, I'm going to go through the list pretty fast because we've talked about most of them already. Number one is, of course, her prenatal epigenetic aberration given to her by her maternal bloodline going back so many generations. Number two is the next most important thing is that mothers are in substance abuse during the time that they're pregnant, or they're having a dietary crisis. In other words, their diet is so bad that the fetus is not getting the nutrients it needs to develop. Number three is early childhood vaccines, which have been proven to affect humans at the RNA level. So the DNA translates into the RNA before it becomes a protein. So vaccines are affecting you at the RNA level. That's how they do what they do. And so that is definitely having an impact on whether her epigenetic tendencies are expressed or not expressed. Number four is fast food diets in the preteen years of young girls. If she's on a fast food diet, there's plenty of evidence that's talking about the fact how this fast food, processed food diet impacts on her development mentally and otherwise. Number five, hormone disruptors. What are hormone disruptors? They are pollutants in the water that affect the development of the endocrine system, the hormones. And so these things are such things like the growth hormones they give chickens and pigs to make them grow fast. And these things wash out and wash into the rivers and get into the water supply. Or medicines that are thrown away in the trash, and they the groundwater, they get into the groundwater, the water supply, mining chemicals and other things like that, medical waste that are improperly disposed, which have the tendency to change your hormonal scenario. So, for instance, most of the things that they give chickens, the growth hormones that they give chickens, they are very estrogen-like. They're very similar to the hormone estrogen in women. And so when they get into the body, they predispose the body to be imbalanced in its estrogen. And in men, they change the estradiol content and whatever. So these things get into the water supply and they're hard to get out. When they did a study on the Potomac River, the EPA, and they found that fish exposed to very small parts per million levels of these hormone disruptors change sex. And you can't filter these things out at the water filtration plants. They're too small. Number 6, black women, as all women, fail to finish puberty. We talked about this in the books and whatever, and why that happens and what to do about it. And all of these things, are factors that determine whether she expresses her epigenetics or not. Number 7 is more psychological. So it's the absence of a father at home, or the presence of a father with weak male energy. So this absence of a father at home has a big, big, big impact. Number 8 is the fact that our culture has changed and young girls are not disciplined. They're spoiled. They don't have chores. They're not working on the farm. They're not doing things that are required of them. And so they're not held accountable for anything. And the lack, you're in these families where it's a female dominant, a yin type of a family scenario, which is looking at the world from the position of self out. Whereas when you have a male dominated household, you're looking at the world from the worldview in. So it tends to cause children to grow up to be more world-centered versus the female household where the children grow up to be self-centered. Okay, they're not held accountable. Number 9 is the womb imprint. And in the books we talk about the fact that women in their first 3 sexual encounters are imprinted by the male that's penetrating them sexually. And based on this composite of the male character, good or bad, the woman tends to want to be attracted, imprinted, and she seeks out a male similar to that, for the next few years in terms of who she's trying to mate with. And normally we say that because these men are immature and for other reasons, most of the womb imprints that young girls, 13, 14, 15, 16, are imprinted with are negative imprints. Number 10 is also a very important one, and that is that the false beliefs imparted by false religions. So you get this religious dogma, preaching shame, guilt, restriction, sexual suppression, all of this stuff. It has a terrible effect on the young girl's spirit, her psyche, her psychology. Number 8 is what we talked about in episode number 6, the black people brand. The black people brand. This subliminal issue that many black people have to see the black people brand the way the media sees it. It's like a herd mentality. The media says black people brand is this, and so black people want to distance themselves from that. And as a consequence of that, the way females look at men and their own self-esteem is negatively impacted by black people brand. Number 12 is that attractive teen girls are not held accountable for their faults. They get a pass. A lot of men, and even more so women, if the girl is cute and she looks good and she presents well to the public, they tend to be forgiven for their other personality faults. That's not true of every mother, of course, but it is a major factor. Number 13 has less of an impact, but nevertheless is significant. We see in our society that the feminists and the lesbians have an agenda when it comes to black men. Through arts, books, movies, institutions, and social media, you know, they undermine the male authority figure. So if you have a young girl and she grows up no father, or not a significant father, no male teachers, no male supervisors on the job, then she goes through life with essentially no male authority figures. By the time she becomes an adult, she's simply just, she's learned to just ignore male authority. She doesn't recognize it. She's never been trained how to read it and how to deal with it. So she just basically is not programmed to recognize male authority, and she doesn't. Number 14 is difficult. We're not going to really get into that deeply. We're talking about her archetypes. We're talking about her Bagua and her incarnation objective and things like that. So, and we haven't presented you with that episode yet, so we're going to delay that discussion. It's a system-generated discussion. But when we take these 14 factors into consideration, and we layer it over this epigenetic predisposition, it gives us almost a precise, complete definition of female fitness for wife, sister, mother, all that stuff like that. The house of the woman stuff. So that it basically can tell you these 14 factors. If you take a look and you measure those 14 factors, it's going to say, based on her epigenetic disposition, if she's going to express it or not. It's going to be go, no-go kind of a thing. It's going to basically tell you how she's going to act and why. And so that brings us back to our central tenet. 50% of African American females are insolvent in the context of relationships. They don't have a choice. They can't do it. Because 50% or more of black females are impacted by these 14 factors we talked about. And so the epigenetics come to the surface and they are rendered toxic to males. Toxic to males. It's not just that they can't be in a relationship with a man. If they try, they are toxic to the male. They can be healed, that's stuff that can be done. And when you look at this, we're going to talk about all of that. But in the current situation, they are toxic to males. And so, basically, it then becomes critical for the black man to be able to recognize who's toxic and who's still viable. Because you're on the Titanic sinking. That's where you are. And so you'd better learn how to spot a lifeboat, a female that you can actually build with. You don't learn that, you're going to sink. You're going down with the Titanic, buddy. I mean, black men can continue to chase skirts for gratification. No, sir. Big mistake. You can continue to act like a beggar and lose your dignity and try to deal with toxic women thinking that something's going to come out of that. No. That's a losing thing. No matter how much of a player you are, no matter how much you learn, no matter how handsome you are, how much money you make, and how much you think that you can get women to do anything you want, you're basically sleeping with a snake that's going to bite you. And it's not her fault. It's not her fault. She was born that way. So, I'm going to, stop this episode at this point in time because that's a lot of information. You need to go back and probably review this a second time because you're going to be saying, what did he say? And it's not good news, but it can save you. And we're not saying that these women are just to be discarded. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that it's hopeless. That's not what we're saying. Because, you know, when I learned all of this stuff back in the Imparted days, I also learned how to fix it. And that's the whole point of all of these books and, you know, and whatever, and the other 4 or 5. And that's the point of, you know, why we're doing the Master Yao Chronicles, is to not only show you the problem, but what it takes to fix it, how to navigate it. We're not saying black men don't have the same types of issues. Their issues are almost polar opposite. They're very different issues. They got issues, but we're not talking about them right now. We're talking about the black woman. And so black men better wake up and smell the coffee. My name is Master Yao. The next 2 episodes are going to be directly associated and connected to this one. The next episode is going to show how to fix it. I am Master Yao, and thank you for watching. Wakanda forever.